I think the most unique aspect of it is the idea of using a small chamber chorus for certain sections of the piece, in addition to the large full chorus and orchestra. These days, in the era of period performance, this kind of large scale, what used to be referred to as big Bach, is not often encountered in the concert hall. Occasionally you do hear it with a large ensemble, but most of the time the works of Bach now have been pretty much taken over by small period chamber ensembles. Much more reflective of the performance practice of Bach's day. And we know that Bach had a very small chorus. There's lots of arguments as to exactly how large that chorus was. About 25 years ago, the musicologist Joshua Rifkin began pointing out that probably Bach's great choral works were sung one on a part, which became a very, very controversial way of thinking about performing Bach. And for quite some time, he recorded the B minor Mass with solos, one on a part, solo singers. It was a very controversial idea. It was a controversial recording. But then a lot of other musicologists sort of took up this idea of thinking about, well, what if we had a much, much smaller ensemble? Did he really just have one on a part, or were there two or three on a part? There's a famous letter that he wrote to the Leipzig Town Council asking for budget money to make sure that he had in his choir that he had three on a part, so that even if somebody in each section got sick on any given Sunday, he could still do double choir motets. Which is a kind of an intriguing insight into how large the ensemble at the Thomaskirche was in Leipzig. The musicologist community began fighting amongst each other about how big the chorus of Bach was, and finally Andrew Parrott ended up writing the book that he said Joshua Rifkin always threatened to write but never got around to writing. And it was a really landmark book because he went back and did the research and discovered that indeed, if you look at the extant parts, the extant manuscript parts that exist from Bach's time that were used in performance, every single thing that he could come up with in terms of looking at these parts indicated that there was only one vocal part, one actual piece of music for each vocal part. And while he said, obviously one person could hold it, and maybe on either side you'd get one or another person, but you certainly weren't going to get 35 or 40 or 50 people looking off of one part in each section. And that spoke to the idea that the physical evidence was that it was for a very small ensemble. Prior to that period, and that's a lot of the current thinking in Bach performance practice, prior to that, in the middle of the 20th century, when conductors began trying to come closer in Baroque music to the size performing forces that would have been more likely, Robert Shaw, in his work on the B minor Mass, decided to use, in a very famous performance run that he did, I think it was 36 performances in 6 weeks or 10 weeks, a very short period of time, where the Robert Shaw Chorale, his professional ensemble, went around the country and performed the B minor Mass night after night after night after night in every little nook and cranny and hamlet. He wanted to bring the B minor Mass. Very small ensemble, very small choral ensemble, 40 professional singers. And he decided to use this concept called concertists, which is that lighter scored sections of the Mass. It's pretty clear if you look at the score that there are certain sections that are scored more fully, and then there are certain sections that are scored much, much, much more lightly. And the implication is, at least in Shaw's mind, was, well, if you're really kind of going by the scoring from a vocal standpoint to match the orchestral standpoint, then you should thin out the choral texture as well in these lighter accompanied moments of the piece. In other words, you don't have the entire chorus just singing cover to cover. So what ends up happening is, in his own performances, because he only used a 40-voice chamber chorus, The moments that were the very lightly scored moments, he had solo singers singing it, which probably was now much, if he had been talking about this, say, 35 years later, we might have said, well, he was going towards what was then the argument in the late 90s about the size of Bach's chorus. So this idea of certain sections being sung by a smaller ensemble and certain sections that were more fully scored for a larger ensemble, I got to know this the first couple of times I worked in the B minor Mass. I employed this idea. I was using a 40-voice chamber ensemble, so I used solo singers just like he did, meaning Shaw. And when we decided to do the B minor Mass, I thought that we could, even though we were using a very large symphonic chorus for the bigger sections, I thought that if we used a smaller chamber ensemble, we could replicate the idea of thinning out the texture and making the texture larger, in effect creating a concertists ensemble, if you will. And so we're going to use the NYCCE, as we're calling it, the NYChoral Chamber Ensemble, as the concertists for this performance. It's a 35-voice ensemble. So we'll have the large chorus of 150 for the larger, more thickly scored moments of the piece, and then it'll pare down at moments to a 35-voice texture, which will match the orchestration much more efficiently and really make it work.
Great.